the climax point of the plagues as well. So with what's going on in Exodus, it's a complete deconstruction of the created world the Egyptians live in. But notice the Israelites are not affected in any of that. They're not required to do anything, but just simply sit back and watch God work until the 10th plague comes. And with that story, when they leave Egypt and they get to the Red Sea, it's basically a complete rebirth of the created order through the Exodus story itself. Think about Noah and the ark, flood covering everything, God preserving them through the ark, bringing them through the flood waters to the new creation on the other side. Same thing here. They're at the bank of the sea opens up, they walk through, they're preserved, the sea comes and kills all those who are against God's people, just like it was in the flood story. Israel emerges from the chaotic waters of the sea. They assemble in sacred space at Sinai, kind of like Eden, because in Genesis chapter 2, if you pay attention to that story, what do you got going on there? God makes the man outside the garden, not in the garden, outside the garden. He puts him in the garden, right? So now God has taken Israel from Egypt and he's brought him to Sinai. That's a resting place, ultimately meant to go to Canaan. But they assemble there first. While they are assembled there, they are commissioned to be a kingdom of priests, like Adam in Genesis 2. Commissioned to be a king, commissioned to be a priest. They are given God's wisdom through Torah. You think about the two trees in the creation story, right? The woman looked upon the tree she wasn't supposed to eat and desired it because she thought it was okay to obtain wisdom through. We talked about that before in our first quarter, but just briefly to remind us, both of those trees represent wisdom. There's the wisdom that God wants man to live by, which is trusting him in his simple command, do not eat of this tree. It's not because that tree is inherently evil. It's not swimming with evil on the inside. It's the simple fact that this is the dichotomy between trusting me and following my wisdom versus attempting to try to obtain wisdom on your own right. But we see how that story goes. Torah is given to Israel in the form of basically these two trees. Moses culminates all of this in saying, I have set before you life and death. Choose life. Adam and Eve in the garden, tree of life, knowledge of good and evil. The Lord saying almost, I have set before you life and death. Choose life, right? So it's a complete rehashing of the creation story through the books of Exodus. Leviticus is where they're getting most of this law and wisdom. And then Numbers and Deuteronomy, they are being prepared to be planted in the land like Adam was being planted in the garden where they will be fruitful, multiply, fulfill their mandate. So if you can think about Adam, Israel kind of being a new Adam almost. Let's think about the Adam or the Abraham and Israel connections. Going back to the story of Exodus from exile, Genesis 10 and 11, the nations have been sent into exile because of what happens at the place where the city tower complex of Babel is being built. They are sent away from God as their languages have been confounded, and now everybody is divvying themselves up into pockets of people who can understand each other. From that chaos that God creates, he calls a man. From the very place where the chaos was. is another nation state in the Mesopotamian River Valley where the very city tower complex of Babel was. He calls him out of that. He's leading him on an exodus away from it all to go to a new place. I will show you, right? But in the very same chapter where God gives this commission to Abraham, at the end of that chapter, what do we see? Abraham finally gets to the land. He notices there's famine. He doesn't stay in the land. He goes to Egypt, the grain bed of the ancient world. When he does, bad things happen. God brought him to sacred space, away from the exile, leading him on an Exodus journey. He doesn't want him to go to a new place of exile, but that's what Abraham does. Now, I'm not saying this is wrong. I don't want to be dogmatic about it. But sometimes people have a tendency to frame that story up of, well, maybe God was leading Abraham to Egypt. I think that we should check that against the story of what happens with Isaac. Because when we get to Isaac, and Abraham is now faded out of the picture, and Isaac is the key figure. He's married to Rebekah, got kids. Moses reminds us a new famine arises, like the one in the days of Abraham, so it's pretty bad. But God steps in, and he tells him, do not go to Egypt. You live in the land that I showed you. That seems to call back into perspective the idea of when Abraham decided to go to Egypt, probably wasn't what God wanted him to do. All right? And ultimately, that signifies God's covenant people throwing themselves into a new exile phase. because Israel, they are delivered from the exile of Egypt to come into this brand new covenant land that God is promising to give them. But what happens in Numbers 13 and 14? They rebel. They want to kill the man God has put over them to lead them. They do not want to go to this land, and they would rather choose the oppressive ease, an oxymoron if there ever was one, the oppressive ease of slavery, where life is handed to them. They know what they're going to do every single day, no matter how bad it is. They would rather be quaintly comfortable with complaining against that rather than taking on faith what God is choosing to do with them at the terminal end of this Exodus, all right? So Abraham has kind of already foreshadowed through his own little short story arc what Israel is ultimately going to do, which means they are ultimately going to wind up going back to a place of bondage. God tells them never to go back to Egypt, and ultimately they never wind up being enslaved by Egypt again. But they do wind up being enslaved by the very place where Abraham came from, Babylon, for nearly 70 years. More Abraham and Israel connections. Genesis 12, Abraham sees there's trouble in the land, a challenge to the promise of God's provision, so he heads to Egypt. Same thing in Numbers 13 and 14. But to unpack this a bit more, Genesis 12, Abraham's afraid. Why does he act this way of lying to Pharaoh, saying, she's my sister? God has promised he will make him a great nation. Ultimately, this promise gets expounded on further, but he says, I will make a great nation come from you. All peoples will be blessed through you. How is that going to happen if God doesn't give Abraham children? Abraham goes to Egypt. He's afraid God can't protect him. Israel has the same fear. In Numbers 12, when the spies come back with their report and they tell them, we seem like grasshoppers in their sight. They'll consume us. There's no possible way we can go to fight against these people with these great fortified cities. They're afraid that their young ones, their wives, and their children are going to be exposed to this terrible threat of being enslaved, because women and children are the most vulnerable people in the ancient world. They will become subject to enslavement by these Canaanite peoples if they attempt to try to go and conquer their land. Because of Abraham's fear, what does he do? This irrational decision of, tell them you're my sister and not my wife so that they won't kill me. Not sure God can protect me. How about we just go back to Egypt because I don't think God can protect us and provide for us. Same thing, Genesis 15, Abraham questions if God will actually give him the land and his provision of seed, literally, children from him and his own, as it's usually said in the King James, his bowels, right? Numbers 14, Israel's questioning if God will even give them the land and preserve their seed. And then in 16, when Abraham decides to have intercourse with the Egyptian handmaid, Hagar, Abraham is attempting to try to help God along in bringing this promise to pass by using Hagar as a surrogate. And that threatens the covenant because it's not the child that's supposed to come through Sarah. Same thing here in Numbers 25. Of course, that's a different part of the story. This is now where a new generation has come along, and instead of being obedient to God as they should have been, learning from the mistakes of their forebears, they wind up through the seduction of Balaam, the prophet hired by Balak, the king of Moab. They fall prey to the seduction of the Midianite women, and that, of course, brings a threat to the promise and the provision of seed from Abraham. So there's lots of points of connection there. Now, I know this kind of gets a little confusing, but let me just explain it. This little box here is the point I want you to see. Obviously, with the bullets there, that should be seen as subpoints, but I can see how the text above it might make it a little misleading, but I can't fit the more robust text in this little white box. So follow the white box, then jump up to the other colored box in its background. In spite of all the rebellion, the hope in the book of Numbers is that God's covenant love is faithful. The green blocks are Abraham's story. The beige blocks below are Israel's story. They're not paralleling each other point for point. It's just showing examples of how Abraham constantly walked away from God, wandering from the straight path that God had set him on, and yet God is constantly reverting him back to the path. Case in point, Abram goes to Egypt. He messes up royally. God delivers them from that by rescuing Sarai. He even blesses Abram with wealth. He sends plagues upon Pharaoh, foreshadowing what will happen when Abraham's seed gets oppressed and enslaved in Egypt. You have the story of Abraham almost foolishly giving the land to Lot. They come out of Egypt, and now they have this little squabble between each other. And Abraham and Lot are like, look, something's got to happen. And we can't apparently be sustained in the same land together. So instead of Abram saying, God has given me and the seed that will come from me this land. So you can come with us, but if you don't want to, then you'll have to go somewhere else. Instead, he gives the preference to his nephew, and he says, you go where you want to go. And if that's to the left, I'll go to the right, which the left would mean the land of Canaan. And if you go to the land of Canaan, I'm going to live outside the land of Canaan. Where did God tell Abraham to go? And so he's about to give the entire promise away to his nephew Lot, which is not the one that God made this covenant promise with. So what happens after, thankfully, Lot chooses right and not left, and then God basically tells Abram again, you and your seed will inherit this land. He never mentions Lot, but you have to kind of wonder why that is. Abram questions if he will possess the land. God mimics the Passover. In Genesis 15, when you have this ceremony where God telling Abram to carve up all these animals and whatnot and put them in a path that God is going to walk through, and then God shows up in the form of a smoking firebrand and a pot, he's mimicking the Exodus. The blood and carnage on the ground all around him and the path that God is walking through is eerily similar to what happens in the Exodus story with God bringing death, destruction, and carnage to the land of Egypt. I mean, it's bad, folks. You get to the death of the firstborn, it's bad. And blood having been spilled with the death of the substitutionary lambs and goats that are used for the Passover. And then God shows up to lead his people. He doesn't just simply give Moses GPS coordinates, meet me here, 10 o'clock sharp. He's there. Pillar of cloud by day, fire by night. What is he walking through these animal carcasses as? Fire and smoke. It's mimicking the Exodus. And in fact, it's even in Genesis 15 that God tells Abraham when he says, how will I know I'll possess this land? You haven't given me any seed. God doesn't say, hey, hang in there, big guy. Just give it a little bit of time. I've got some things cooking over here, and I'm eventually going to get to giving your wife the child that she wants. Just trust me on this. He gives him this whole enigmatic thing of, your people are going to go live in a land that's not theirs up to 4 generations later, and then I will judge that land and bring them out. He tells them the Exodus is going to happen after he just showed him this in a vision, right? So God is answering this through his promise of covenant faithfulness, even though Abram doubts. And then Abram winds up messing up again, having a son through Hagar. Circumcision is a sign of the covenant, but in case you weren't picking up on this, it's also a sign of judgment. Think about it. We're all adults. I think I can get a little graphic with you because everybody in here, I'm sure, has probably got babies, so we all know how this works. When a male gets circumcised, a piece of his foreskin gets cut off his penis, right? That gets removed. It's cut off. Notice how God, from that point on, keeps telling all of God's people, if a boy is not circumcised 8 days after his birth, guess what? He gets cut off. And then he uses the same language for anybody that violates the terms of the covenant, like working on the Sabbath. You get cut off. You don't want to observe the Passover. You get cut off. It's bringing back to mind this idea of circumcision. So it's a form of judgment. Why does it have to happen here? Why couldn't Abram give himself a tattoo or put the thing in his forehead? Because Abram allowed him the use of his member to bring about another child that was never meant to be part of the equation. God brings judgment. Your seed that comes from you belong to me. I am the one who gives that, not you when you decide to have it. It's a form of judgment. But through it, God also uses it as a blessing as well, because he tells him the land will be promised. And I could go on through the rest of this at the bottom, but I'll give you time to read that later on your own. For the sake of time, I'll move on. The Ballad of Balaam. This is what I want you to focus on right here. When we get to this story, and you got to know this is going to be one of the stories we're going to focus on, this would be a really good thing for you to spend your time on, because Israel has no idea what's going on. None. They're down there in the valley. And at several points, we have Balaam and Balak looking at them from this point of the camp, and then they move over to here to see this point of the camp, and then this point of the camp. Israel's never brought into this as far as any of their elders or leaders interfacing with these two people. But what's happening up on the mountain is you've got a king who doesn't want these people who are already terrorating through the land and conquering these peoples on the eastern side of the Jordan. He doesn't want himself or his people to be next, even though they're distant relatives to the Israelites. He wants this sorcerer Balaam to come and judge them. All the while, Israel's unsuspecting that God is providing for them on the mountaintop by keeping the lips of Balaam totally consecrated to himself. You say what I tell you to say. And he never opens his mouth once to speak curse. In fact, if anything, he speaks blessing and prophecy of the time in which Israel will crush the heads of Moab. Now, of course, it leads to a terrible story or situation with Balaam or working around that and leading Balak to seduce the men of Israel using the Midianite women. But that aside, this is a huge theme inside the book of Numbers, that even though Israel continues to slip on every banana peel put in their path, yet God is faithful, and He even works behind the scenes to provide for them. How do we see our current kingdom plight worked into that as goes focusing on the gospel project? Oh my goodness. We slip on so many banana peels, yet God is faithful. God is working behind the scenes to orchestrate covenant mercy and grace. So many things going on in our lives that we will never know about here. But we have those promises built all throughout the writings of the epistles or the apostles and their epistles. Great moments to bring in some stories from gospels and epistles to help bolster the idea of God providing even when we're not faithful. In fact, we even have that promise from Paul to Timothy that even when we're faithless, He is faithful. All right, I'm not going to read these verses for you. Every one of these verses is meant to support that heading. Israel and Judah are headed for the wilderness again. In the book of Numbers, the whole thing ends with them coming out of the wilderness once we get on the other end of Deuteronomy into the conquest of Joshua. But as the story arc develops, we know that another wilderness exile is on the horizon. 1,000 years in the land, it really doesn't go well for them, right? Civil war and kingdoms diverging from each other, bad kings, some good kings, and eventually exile off into Babylon, after an exile off into Assyria. And we have all of these prophets saying this, but I will pull your attention down here to this bottom one. Notice this is from Malachi chapter 2. Malachi is a post-exile prophet, and yet God still says these things. So I in turn have made you despised and humiliated before all the people, because you are not keeping my ways, but are showing partiality in your instruction. As fellow teachers, if you are trying to build the idea of, God began the restoration of Israel through Zerubbabel and Joshua in the days of Haggai and Zechariah, with bringing them back to the land, that is not the ultimate restoration God spoke of. It's like a dress rehearsal. Like Abraham's journey is a dress rehearsal for the big Exodus that comes in the book of Exodus, this restoration into the land is a dress rehearsal for what will happen when Messiah comes. All right? It's not the terminal end of those prophecies of restoration. Messiah coming and inaugurating this new Exodus from exile is the actual fulfillment of those things. If Malachi is using this kind of language after they've been in the land for over 100 years at this point, I think it's pretty obvious that while they're back in Israel and have their city and temple again, they're still living in exile. But while they're in exile, just like we have the promise in the book of Numbers, God sustains them in spite of their faithlessness. He will continue to provide for His people. He will sustain them. All of this language is kingdom era, messianic in nature. It's the promise that God is ultimately going to bring about this era, not based on the merit of His people and that they deserve it, but in spite of the lack of that merit. Let you read those things on your own. All right. Wisdom of God. So this gets us back into the 6 themes we spent our last time on. In about 25 minutes, I'm going to try to get through this, okay? But I'm not rushing it. So again, if I get to the last 2 or 3 and we don't cover them, I'm totally fine cutting it off there, all right? But hopefully, Lord willing, we can. Wisdom of God. Think about Adam and Israel again. Just some points of connection here. I'll try to sum them up for you. Adam is crowned king and ordained a priest. Israel is the same. If they are to be a kingdom of priests, that means everybody rules and reigns as a king within. Now, that doesn't mean we should think about it in the typical proto or archetypal way of there's a king, there's his subjects. There can only be one king. Everybody can't be kings. And even amongst the governance of Israel itself, God will bring about a tribe who will be priests for the priests. If the whole nation is priests to the nations, then inside of Israel, God creates a tribe who will become priests to the priests. And if they are to be kings ruling in the new sacred space, the new creation that God has made from them that's supposed to expand out and encompass all humanity, there will be a king for the kings. It's not surprising then that we have those very titles that describe Jesus as the King of Kings, right? Nonetheless, moving on. Adam was placed in sacred space. Israel will be in Canaan. Adam was guided to walk in the Lord's wisdom with the mandates that he gave him of what he could do and could not do. So setting before him the choices. God does the same thing in giving them Torah or instruction, because that's exactly what that word in Hebrew means. It's instruction. As the Lord's wisdom that was meant to guide them, okay? So with Adam, it was one simple command, but it would be built on as time progresses. As Adam flourishes in his relationship with the Lord, then ultimately God would lead him to greater heights and expansion of his wisdom. The same thing was meant to happen with Israel, but instead of one person, you've got a whole nation of people. So God has to be a bit more forthcoming in the rules and regulations he wants them to live by, but they're couched in the terms of wisdom. Understand this. There's not a single example that we find in the entire Old Testament where we have a judge or anybody in a governing position of authority using any of these principles as case law. Okay? The only example we can come up with is the one time where some guy's picking up sticks on the Sabbath day. They inquire of the Lord what to do, and he says, put him to death. There's a lot going on there. But from that, it's not meant to be seen as, okay, so in every case where we have God saying, if this happens, kill them, that's exactly what they're supposed to run to. In fact, throughout the rest of the ancient Near East, and this is part of the reason why at the beginning of last quarter, I started out with helping us understand how the creation narrative is embedded in this world where other creation myths that are somewhat like it exist, is because in these ancient Near Eastern societies, they have their own law codes that work a lot the same way, like the Code of Hammurabi amongst the Babylonians, that's somewhat contemporary to the time of Moses and the Israelites. These are guiding principles. There's nowhere near enough law to govern everything that they have questions over. Hence the reason why when you get to the days of Jesus and you see Jesus and the disciples walking through the fields, taking grain off the stalks and grinding it in their hands to eat it, where do you find that in the Old Testament as being forbidden? What is the precedent that they say they are violating? You're working on the Sabbath. But who said that's work? Why is that wrong? This is all the extra fluff they built into it to help make sense of what you can do and cannot do to help them rightly walk in accordance with the law. These guiding principles are meant to display God's wisdom. That's what we must understand. Adam would have ultimately gained the knowledge of good and evil without ever eating from the tree if he had just simply leaned upon the Lord's wisdom. And ultimately, the people of Israel would, through their obedience, experience the same thing. I've kind of lost myself on my slide. Oh, here we go. The fifth point there on the top with Adam. Adam was meant to fill the earth with God's wisdom in ruling and subduing. The garden was an expansion project. It wasn't meant to be static. They fill this place with image bearers. We kick the barriers down and we keep pushing this puppy out until eventually we encompass the whole world from horizon to horizon. Notice that when we look at Israel, 4 times they are told that their boundaries will extend to the river Euphrates, giving you the scripture references. Yet the boundaries that are allotted to each of the tribes only go as far north as Mount Hermon. So I'm giving you some maps here. It might be easier for you to see on your own map. But way up there at the top, so we've got this brown chunk right here of East Manasseh, and way up at the top is a little triangle that says Mount Hermon. That's the northern extent of their tribal allotments. When Moses and Joshua give out the land, this is what you're to go and settle in. So why are they told the boundaries will extend to the Euphrates River as far back as Abraham, right? Well, look at this. Here around Damascus, between Damascus and Dan is where Mount Hermon is, and way up there, that blue squiggly line is the Euphrates. So in order for them to possess that land, what's going to happen to Israel? It expands. How is that going to happen? Why doesn't God give them all that land to start with? Because it's conditional. You walk in my wisdom, you get to expand the garden. You walk in my wisdom, I'll expand your borders to the Euphrates. Because Abraham and his people were meant to inherit the world, right? Adam would have ultimately gained the right to eat from the tree of life. Again, remember, God does not tell him to eat from the tree of life. If he walked with him in wisdom, that eventually would have been what happened, right? And if Israel walks in discernment with God, which leads to wisdom, it will ultimately lead to life for them. I'm sorry. I want to read this middle passage for you. Moses says this, the words of the Lord, I have taught you statutes and ordinances as the Lord my God has commanded me, so that you may follow them in the land you are entering to possess. Carefully follow them, for this will show your wisdom and understanding in the eyes of the peoples. Why did God give these restrictions and guidances and allowances through Torah? This is the terminal point. So the nations will see the wisdom you walk in, and that they will envy and admire you. When they hear about all these statutes, they will say, this great nation is indeed a wise and understanding people. For what great nation is there that has a God near to it as the Lord our God is to us whenever we call to him? And what great nation has righteous statutes and ordinances like this entire law I set before you today? Well, there's the Babylonians. They got the Code of Hammurabi. A lot of similarities there. There are stark differences. Case in point, right up here at the top of the left edge, God says in Exodus 23, at the beginning stages of giving Torah, you must not oppress a resident alien. You yourselves know what it feels like to be a resident alien because you were resident aliens in the land of Egypt. No other nation around them would ever show any expression of mercy or grace to any resident aliens or slaves. But God is instructing them to do that to the Israelites. Why? Think of what I delivered you from. What's the right heart response? Don't ever inflict that tyranny on anybody else. Or the next one, Exodus 23, verse 12. Do your work in 6 days. Rest on the Sabbath, so that your ox and your donkey may rest, and that the son of your female slave, as well as the resident alien, may be refreshed. The guidance and wisdom behind this is that even the beasts of the land get to experience refurbishment and rest. It's not that man was made for the Sabbath, but Sabbath for man, as Jesus said, right? The guiding principle behind it is, unlike any other society around them, where you literally are worked to death from the cradle to the grave every day of the week, unless you're part of the nobility, it's not like that in Israel. Even the foreigners, the animals get to rest. All these commands about don't strip your vineyard clean, leave stuff out there for the widows and the orphans to be able to take, right? You are to have the same law, not differing codes, for the people who come amongst you that are not even native born to your land and have never lived here a day in their life. You do not mete out injustice to somebody simply because they are not a part of you. Nationalism is not meant to exist in ancient Israel. I would read them all, but I want to go to Deuteronomy 15, verses 1 through 2 right here and read those up at the top right edge. At the end of every 7 years, you must cancel debts. This is how you cancel debts. Every creditor is to cancel what he has lent to his neighbor. He is not to collect anything from his neighbor or brother, because the Lord's release of debts has been proclaimed. And along with that, you free every slave, and every field that belonged to a neighbor from another tribe, you give it back to him. It's a general reset point, like the day you walked into this land. Why is that? Because it's meant to commemorate renewal, the deliverance from exile in Egypt, exodus into this promised sacred space. Guarantee you, no nation outside of Israel would ever contemplate such ludicrous ridiculousness. Because if you're strong enough to exploit somebody and get from them what increases your wealth and holdings, why would you ever give it back? What stupid person gives their slaves away when they're your workforce? But this is the wisdom that God trusts they will walk in. Mostly doesn't happen, though. But anyway, that's the idea behind it. Going here into this slide, I will just point out at the top right here from Deuteronomy 4 and Proverbs 2. Moses says in Deuteronomy 4, now Israel, listen to the statutes and ordinances I'm teaching you to follow, that you may live, enter, and take possession of the land that the Lord your God is giving you. The writer of the Proverbs in chapter 2 says, notice this comes from the very heart of wisdom literature. The entire first 9 chapters of Proverbs is all about this command to do not forget the instructions of your father, the lessons of your mother. Seek after wisdom. She's a beautiful lady. Walk in the wisdom and light of her counsel. She's more precious than jewels. Anyone who gets her is like eating from the tree of life. The proverb writer in chapter 2 says, for the upright will inhabit the land, those who follow wisdom, and those of integrity will remain in it. It's as if to say, remaining in the land is conditional upon walking in the light of the Lord's wisdom. And how is that given? Torah. Torah. All right. So, kingdom of God. Your kingdom come. Obviously, in the beginning of the creation story, God is the potentate, which means he is the supreme ruler. But he commissions Adam to be a king under his authority over this terrarium that he's made for him. Adam rules under the Lord's authority, obviously. And the earth is ultimately meant to be subdued, and the garden is supposed to expand. That's part of the blessing of be fruitful, multiply, rule everything in every part of this domain I've made for you. And as part of that, subdue the earth. Subdue means I have given you an unfinished project, right? It's like Bob Ross painting the streams and the clouds and inviting one of his students to come right behind him and start putting those happy little trees all over the place. It's the same thing here. I've not given you a perfect world. I want you to build upon that. Notice why at the end of the story in Scripture, all the way at the end of Revelation, we do not go back to some primitive setting where we're all walking around in a garden picking apples from trees completely naked. The way that God pictures new creation is this beautifully golden gilded city coming down from heaven that's so massive, it's kind of meant to be filling the entire landscape from any person's point of vantage. 1,400 miles cubed. It's not to say civilization, society, and advancement is bad, because that's what God wants, for us to improve upon what He has given us. That's part of subduing. The same thing happens here with the expansion project of Canaan. God assumes kingship over Israel. They are commissioned in Exodus 19 to rule as kings under His authority, and the nations are going to be subdued. Notice in Deuteronomy 19, Deuteronomy 9. But understand that today the Lord your God will cross over ahead of you as a consuming fire. He will devastate and subdue them before you. Why use the same term subdue from Genesis chapter 1? And why is God not leaving this squarely in their hands, but He is promising to walk before them, again, as a consuming fire to start this project? Because the Amorites, chief tribe in the land, back in Genesis 15, their iniquity has brimmed over the edge of the cup. It's met its full mark. Now it's time for judgment. God means to eradicate the Canaanites. Again, completely take out the thorn bush from the land. God wants to plant this vine He plucked up from Egypt. But that vine is meant to go past the hedges. It's meant to go all the way up to Euphrates, down to the river of Egypt, as it says, and then eventually to other countries or other nations, as the light and wisdom of the Lord's counsel carried by His people will expand. That's why God is saying, I'm starting the initial phase of subduing for you and giving you this new space, then I want you to expand upon it. And He even makes provision for a king. Notice how this king is supposed to act. This is hugely paramount, as goes Jesus' concept of king and kingdom throughout the Gospels. We're told they are supposed to appoint a king over them from their brothers, the one whom the Lord chooses. Do not set a foreigner over you. That should be obvious for many reasons why that can't be the case. But notice here, he's supposed to become a total Bible nerd. He's supposed to write a copy of the instruction that Moses gave the people for himself on a scroll in the presence of the priests, so that it doesn't become his own understanding or version of Moses' precepts. So this way, the Levitical priests are kind of commissioned here with this sacred trust of making sure that if the king does this, which we have no record of any king ever doing it, if a king does this, that it remains true to Moses' words. That book of the law is supposed to be with him all the days of his life and read from every single day, so that way he will never think of himself as any more superior to his own countrymen, that he himself is as equal to them as they are to him, right? And then, of course, we have these other negatives here of he's not supposed to acquire horses, not supposed to go back to Egypt to get horses so that he doesn't start trusting in his military might. He's not supposed to trust in wealth. And unlike all the other kings, he's not to amass for himself many, many wives. In other words, in comparison to all the other kingdoms of the landscape around, if this is their ideal of kingdom, God in this little section has taken it and completely inverted it on its head. And that's exactly what Jesus is doing in the Gospels. When he gets to Matthew 16 and he says, "Who do you say that I am?" "You're Messiah." "Yes, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah." And nobody had to tell you this. My Father in heaven showed you that. But now understand, I've got to go to Jerusalem. When I get there, chief priests, scribes, elders are going to crucify me, hand me over to the Gentiles, but I will rise from the grave. No, you can't do that. You're Messiah, you're son of David. Not going to happen. Jesus, from that point on, starts a long and drawn-out series of stories that's more pronounced in Luke's gospel of taking this idea of kingdom that they have and turning it upside down. And when he starts explaining to them, referenced back in Matthew 5, 6, and 7, the ideals of this kingdom, It's in every way different from how they are expected to live in the world that they do of kings and emperors. When the strong rule through the might of their fist, the rich get richer, the poor get poorer, and everybody who's seen as vulnerable are exploited along the way. When Jesus says, if I, your Lord, will wash your feet, don't think for a second you aren't supposed to do the same. The greatest amongst you becomes a servant of all. It's a total inversion of this. It's seen right here in this concept of how the king is supposed to rule in God's ideal of kingdom. And don't let us not forget, this is firmly rooted in Genesis 1 and 2 with this concept of king and priest. All right, temple. This is just a reworking of the schematic I gave you from the first quarterly instruction. I've just reworked it a little bit to try to make some of these arrows not intersect the picture so much. I won't read these things for you. I'll let you do that on your own. But what I will say from this slide is that it's not coincidental that we have a 7-day record of God creating the earth, the cosmos, in Genesis chapter 1. And when we see this broken down for us, which you may have already kind of come across if you read the book that was given to you as a gift last time, Reading Moses, Seeing Jesus, the author makes it a beautiful point to bring this up, that the tabernacle itself, its entire construct and design is given in 7 separate speeches through Moses to the people. Why is that? To sum it all up and make it very concise, it's like the cosmos, the world, are a temple in which God and man live in together. The tabernacle and the temple are meant to be the exact same thing. Why is it that you see images all throughout the temple and later, or tabernacle and later the temple, that are all meant to draw us back to the Garden of Eden? Palm trees, pomegranates, vines all over the place, cherubim everywhere you look around. That's why. And ultimately, as God had completed the work, Moses also is the one who's credited for finishing the work and bringing it all together. As God inspected it, so did Moses cap off the final phase of this with inspecting everything that the 2 supervisors, Bezalel and Aholiab, the one the Holy Spirit had infused with wisdom to construct and weave and craft and mold and chisel and bevel all of these things to make sure it was exactly according to the specifications the Lord wanted. Because now the people are carrying around with them a scaled-down version of the Garden of Eden to open up the blessings of Eden and the gateway back to God's presence, not just for themselves, but for all humanity. If Canaan is an expansion project, that's the idea, right? All right. Notice we get all of this language throughout the Bible of the Lord wanting to plant his people. The Lord planted the man in the garden in Genesis 2. In Exodus 15, here we are. We've got this picture of the Exodus ending, at least this phase of coming out of Egypt, with the people of Israel coming out of Egypt. They cross through the Red Sea. As the waters have closed in upon the Egyptians and they're washing up on the seashore, Moses leads the congregation of Israel in this wonderful song about his salvation, how the Lord has become their rock. He's become their salvation. And he gets to this point in verse 17 when he says, you, God, will bring them in and plant them on the mountain of your possession. Lord, you have prepared the place for your dwelling. Dwelling meaning the temple or tabernacle, the place where heaven and earth will become one in this new Eden. And your hands will establish the sanctuary. And in every one of these verses, from Psalms, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Amos, all of those prophets speaking of exile and what God intends to do after exile is over is plant his people once again in the Messianic era. Why does that matter? Because part of that is definitely very intimately married with the concept of temple. Messiah will build temple. I get this stuff from Jews all the time who refuse to believe that Jesus fulfilled the prophecies of the Old Testament. They go back to places like Ezekiel 40 through 48. Messiah has to build a new temple. That's what he did at Pentecost. When Solomon's done, he dedicates the temple, fire falls from heaven, consumes the sacrifices. Jesus said, don't leave Jerusalem, wait for the promise of the Father. 10 days after his ascension, there they are, mighty rushing wind, fire from heaven, speaking in different tongues. All Jews from every part of the Roman Empire and beyond, back here in the land for Shavuot, And what happens? A new temple is christened inside the old one that branches out beyond that to start planting temple everywhere beyond Jerusalem. Again, Isaiah 2, Micah 4. Word of the Lord will go out from Zion. In the last days, the mountain of the Lord will rise above every mountain and hill, because God will plant his people. All right, priesthood. Pretty brief, but just think about it. The high priest, a new Adam, because Adam gets to walk around in this similarly glorified sense. We could talk all day about what did Adam and Eve appreciate about each other's physical appearance before the fall happened. Some would even say that they glowed. No Rudolph in reference intended. But nonetheless, something definite, significant about the way they looked before versus after the fruit, right? Why is it the high priest becomes the most ornate one that gets to go into the most intimate sanctum of the temple? Why, if all the rest of them just get to wear linen, is he the one that gets to wear white linen with blue robe, with golden breastplate, bedazzled with jewels, gold filigree everywhere you look, a crown, and an actual title on the top of it in a gilded gold plate that says, holy, separate to the Lord? Why is that? Why is it he's the one that gets to go right past the cherubim on the curtain into the presence of the cherubim on the mercy seat where God's presence is? He's a new Adam. If the tabernacle and the temple are a scaled-down version of the Garden of Eden, he's the new Adam. How do we tie this into the gospel? Revelation 1, if we're a kingdom of priests, guess what we get to do? God's presence everywhere we go, every day, when you bow your heads and pray. But friend, we have to start bringing these things out for our Bible students. We are the ones responsible for helping restore the often bereft connection that we have been created through previous generations of erroneous theology that seek to separate the Old and New Testament when they are as intimately connected as our own arms are on this body that bring them together. If we can help them see these concepts in the Old being built toward crescendoing in the New Testament, it gives it that much more momentum and helps us understand what our kingdom mandate actually is. Lastly, covenants. I'll give you this here on the far right side of the screen. This we've already kind of talked about a lot already. God invites Israel into his presence at the giving of the covenant. This kind of happens in a representative fashion, though. But notice how this happens. It's a bit of an odd story, but if we understand it in light of what's already come before, then it makes all the more sense. God took the covenant scroll and read, I'm getting confused. Moses took the covenant scroll, read it aloud to the people. They responded, "We'll do all that the Lord has commanded." After that, Moses then goes up with Aaron and his two sons, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of Israel's elders. They saw the God of Israel. Beneath his feet was something like a pavement made of lapis lazuli, as clear as the sky itself. God did not harm the Israelite nobles. They saw him. They ate with him. This is right back to the Garden of Eden, right? God makes the man, commissions him as king, ordains him as priest, brings him into sacred space, walks amongst him, gives him instructions about food. Same thing here. God gives Torah instruction through Moses after he's told him, "You're to be a kingdom of priests for me," invites a cross-section of them through their leader, Moses, and all the tribal leaders up there to dine with him, to dwell with him. That's the idea. It's a goal of what he wants to do with his people every single day. That's part of the covenant blessing that God has promised through Adam, given on to Noah, Abram, who becomes Abraham, Moses mediated to Israel, and ultimately Jesus as the bringer of the new covenant. And even Moses, as something like a new Adam, gets to experience the Sabbath rest of the Lord when he's up there on the mountain in the cloud in God's for 40 days and 40 nights. Because notice this, he tells us in Exodus chapter 24, the glory of the Lord settled on Mount Sinai. The cloud covered it for 6 days. On the seventh day, he called Moses up from the cloud to enter into the cloud. Why is it we have 6 days of creation? On the sixth day, God makes the man. Seventh day, God rests, not because he's tired. He's made the sacred space, brings the man in there. Sabbath rest, meant to perpetually go on forever with God and man dwelling in sacred space together. It's exactly what's going on with Moses up in the cloud after a 6-day waiting period, right? In other words, the covenant that God makes with Israel is not just simply law. So many of us have been taught the Mosaic covenant is all about law, 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 law. It's so much more than that. And it's not a Mosaic covenant. It's the covenant that God has already established. It's an expansion of that. And we are seeing the recycling of these primitive themes that are laid down much more simplistically in the opening of Genesis, coming out in a much more amplified way now in Exodus, but it's still the same thing. And then atonement. I could go on forever. We could have spent the whole day on this. I'm not trying to shortchange this, folks, but I'm not trying to put this in the backdrop and make it seem like this doesn't matter. But what I am simply saying is that sadly, we don't get a lot of space to really talk too much about this. In fact, even the Day of Atonement from Leviticus 16 is not the one chapter we focus on when we go to Leviticus. It's chapter 6. But we can take this and expand it out into so many lessons. Use that cheat sheet I gave you there as a reference. But I will say this. One thing that I hope that we can start kind of looking at is the idea the Day of Atonement and the Passover theme are blended together in the crucifixion of Jesus. Again, why is it that Jesus wasn't crucified on the Day of Atonement? When the Day of Atonement is supposed to be the time when the sins of the people are forgiven through the intercessory action of the priest bringing the blood in to the mercy seat. There's this whole concept by John in his epistles about Jesus being the propitiatory offering, our mercy seat. That's all Day of Atonement stuff. Passover, there is no going behind the curtain and putting blood on the Ark of the Covenant where the mercy seat resides. It's the blending of two images together because Jesus can't be crucified on Passover, resurrected, crucified again on Day of Atonement, and resurrected. Makes no sense. It's not that one is more important than the other. It's the bringing of the two together because much of this is a recycling of the same theme. In fact, something you might not have noticed, but elements of the Passover ritual are already familiar to us from several stories in Genesis. You're like, say what? I don't hear God saying anywhere in Genesis about take a lamb that's a year old or less, has to be spotless, and you kill it, shed its blood, put it up on the doorposts, making unleavened bread, eating all this with bitter herbs, with your coat tucked in, and being ready to get out of there. Where's that in Genesis? Well, you won't find that strict structure in Genesis. But some of those elements you do. Some of those elements of sacrificing a lamb and the mention of firstborn, like you have with the Passover story, because Passover comes with the commensurately with the 10th and final plague of the death of the firstborn of Egypt and the redemption of the firstborn of Israel. In fact, if you go back to the story of Cain and Abel, firstborn son, Abel's not the firstborn son, but sacrifice of a lamb. What's all that about? Why is this sacrifice even happening in the first place? Some details were not told there, but it is a foreshadowing of the Passover. Same thing here with some of the other stories in Genesis 15 with that covenant ceremony of Abraham there with God. That mimics the Passover in a very real way, as we've already talked about. Or even in the story of Lot. Lot in Sodom. Angels come. It's not like as soon as they come through the door, these guys wanting to gang rape them are banging on the door saying, let us have them. They actually have time for a meal. It's later on into the night when the whole city comes out against them to snag up these angels. So what happens when from the time when the guys go into Lot's house until the guys show up at his door? They have a meal. And why does he bake unleavened bread for them? Same thing before these angels actually go into the city, when the angels come with the Lord and they show up at Abraham's spot out in the oaks of Moreh, right? Abraham runs into the tent and tells Sarah, go get a choice calf and bring it out and hurry up and fix it. Make cakes for them. What's the actual Hebrew term? Unleavened bread. They've got a meal that's a young calf, unleavened bread. Judgment's about to happen. Restoration of a remnant on the other end. It's Passover. It's all there. It shouldn't be surprising to us that God just aggrandizes this in a greater way when we actually get to the story of Israel coming out of Egypt. All right? So it's just a recycling of these themes. But when we get into the Day of Atonement, and I'll end with this, my last slide. If you think about it, it's almost a complete reversal of exile. You think about it. Here, if you're noticing this, this is east, right? The opening to the Garden of Eden is totally facing east, rising of the sun. Adam sins, gets kicked out. Cherubim are right there at the garden gate facing east. Why is it when God tells them to build the tabernacle, when they set it up, he tells them to face the opening of the tabernacle toward the sun when it rises, the east? Because when Adam, the high priest, the new Adam, walks in there on the Day of Atonement with the blood that goes past the cherubim, the ticket that gets him in on the inside. It's as if to say, this is what God is going to do through all humanity. He's reversing the exile by allowing humanity to now come past the cherubim, positioned as man's enemies, keeping them out and away from God's presence, to allow them to come in with the thing that God requires, the blood of a substitute. And they get to go in, and he gets to go in, a representative for all humanity, Adam, king priest, representing God, creation before God and God before creation, going in there with the blood, reversing the exile. Okay, so I'll just point you out this reference here. Right here on this part of the screen, we just weren't quite able to pull it together before we got here today, but that book is on order, and you're all going to be given that as a gift, thankfully, because of our staff. A quick shout out to Richard and the staff who had prepared these books for us and got it done so we could have it today. So big, huge applause to them. And look forward to getting those books. I think if you do, it's a quick read. It's a little more than about 160 pages. A lot of stuff I brought from that book are in the slides today, and it will just help fill in the gaps and spaces that I couldn't quite do in our time here. So if no closing questions, then I will turn you over to your respective groups. Kids off with Wendy. Any youth teachers off with Steve and Amber. Not sure where they are. Okay, in Big House. And then after about a 5-minute break, you adults will jump into this, and we'll unpack how this looks a little more and answer your questions and try to soothe over some of the rough edges.